This is a set of notes that was first given to first period, and then my other class was asked to take notes on this video because of technological issues. We couldn't do the lesson in class synchronously, so you were asked to do it asynchronously. The reason I'm using this particular example is because it has a lot of the components of Cornell, and I think it's a good example of what I'm looking for when you're taking notes. You'll notice that all the diagrams here are labeled. They're fairly neat. They're even color-coded. That's going to make it a lot easier for this person to go back and understand, and they're getting a lot of the nuances that other students missed when they took notes. They have the example clearly labeled. I've seen students write table salt without writing down that it's an example, for instance, and therefore they would not understand what the heck table salt had to do with any of this. This happens to be wrong, but so this person really should go back and change this, and perhaps this is a table salt's an example of ionic bonding, not sharing of electrons. But the point is that they've labeled the word example. So if the person were going to go now and try to do the 6 R's, one of the things that they would go back and do is revise, and they would identify this as being incorrect, and they would correct this, or perhaps they would just go ahead and circle it. I would hate to see them have to redraw these notes since they're so well done in overall, and label this as an example of ionic bonding, or an ionic association. The point being that this would be an example of revision. When I look for examples of reflection, I look for things like the summary. And the summary shows an example of reducing and also of reflecting. So they took a look at all these notes and they summarized it into one sentence. They have ideas, they have columns, they have main ideas here, important words and key phrases. They've listed them here. Again, an example of reducing. An example of reflection is going back and color coding and highlighting. Comments like, reminds me of the North and South Pole, for polar meaning having two sides. He or she reflected on what polar means. So they were able to take these notes. This short video that was posted in Schoology for you, and they were able to complete a lot of the 6 R's that would be required to complete the Cornell Notes process. Remembering that Cornell Notes is not about dividing the page into 1/3 and 2/3. That's part of it. That's the format. The key here is completing those 6 R's, recording with this, which obviously this person did a really good job of recording, getting most of the content that was shown. I've seen a lot of people list. One student actually typed out, went through the trouble of typing out all the major ideas in a list. That's fine. That might even be a good example of reduction. But the person that made this list, that typed it out, I'm assuming they listened, perhaps they wrote it all out, and then they typed it up in a neater format, thinking that it would be easier to read, which I could understand. However, when they go back to study this list of material, it's going to be out of context. They're not going to have any of the drawings, any of the associations, any of the major ideas listed. They're not going to have any of their thinking. Anything that they thought was important is going to be lost unless they somehow wrote it into this list, and they had not, in the example that I'm thinking of. And even if you have this list that has all the important ideas like covalent bonds or sharing electrons And ionic bonds are giving and taking electrons, and an electromagnetic force are those are forces that pull uh, objects together, like two magnets, or the difference between electronegativity between two atoms can make a molecule polar. All this person could make that long list, yet creating a set of notes like this where you're able to see the reduction, the reflection, the thought. Number one, it lets me know that this person here has given some thought to the ideas. It's just not just writing them down, but they actually put some thought into it. Secondly, when this person goes back to study or have a discussion or look something up, this person is going to be able to associate the diagrams with the key words. They're able to look and see what they were thinking when they did their summary, and perhaps their summary is wrong, like this example was wrong. They can go back and correct it. Now, this person decided to scratch this out. They made some mistake or what have you. That's fine. I would erase it if I were them. I've seen people go back and rewrite their notes in entirety. I think that's kind of a lot of work. I like to write it in pencil and just to go back and erase and add, or even make a note. I was thinking this was an example of covalence, actually an example of ionic, so you don't even have to scratch or erase anything. Just add a little added note. This would be an example of revising, of correcting a mistake or an idea. So this is what makes Cornell Notes superior to other forms of note-taking, which is just writing down whatever it is that's said in class, because this is not about gathering some points by writing some material down. If you look at the rubric, sure, there is a level of content that you're expected to record, right? That's the first of the 6 R's. You need to record the information. You need to listen and record. So you have to be able to do both. Listen and write this material down. But then you also have to give it some thought. So after you've listened, you've recorded, you don't even have to do it in class. You could do it at home after you've had some time, perhaps even after you've read the chapter. You have to then take that material, whatever it is that you wrote, and whatever diagrams you drew that connected your objects in your notes, whatever that is, you then have to think about what were the key ideas, what were the key words. Maybe it's said in the class. Maybe you can write them down as key words in class. Perhaps I, as a teacher, repeat it, and so you write it down in the important sections. Perhaps you have a question in class, and you're not comfortable saying it out loud, so you write the question down. Maybe I give you a question for thought, and you write that question down. But at some point, whether it's right after class or that evening, you should be able to summarize what the notes were about. You should be able to, and summary is an example of reduction and reflection, where you're taking all this information and you're considering what was important, how do I write it in a way that makes sense, it summarizes all these key ideas. And I think this was very close to being a great summary. It mentioned strong forces. It could have focused more on covalent versus ionic bonding, those kinds of things, in polar covalent versus non-polar covalent bonds. Another thing is using graphic organizers. Maybe some person can go back afterwards and revise their notes and add a graphic organizer where they could take covalent bonding and say sharing of electrons. And then they could divide it into two. And say, okay, well, there's two kinds of covalent bonding and sharing of electrons. One's even sharing, and we're going to call that non-polar. And then there's uneven sharing, and we're going to call that polar. And then they could then make another series or addition a column to their table, and they could say ionic bonding forms salts, all kinds of salts, table salt being one of them. In ionic bondings, there's one atom takes, or one element, takes an electron, and the other gives. And you could take that and draw all kinds of lines of association. You could create several more pages from the reading that discusses this as being an association, where this is how does this satisfy those two rules that we came up with in class, right? Those two rules of having a full octet or full outer shell, and having a full outer shell, rule one, having a full outer shell. And to being neutral, when obviously in a salt you have one positive and then one negative. How does this end up being neutral and satisfying rule 1 and rule 2? How do these ionic bonds satisfy those two rules? I think it's easier to see how covalent bonds satisfy those rules. And understanding this also helps you understand why polar materials can dissolve ionic substances. And then you'd have to think about those drawings that we made in class about that had to do with solutes and solvents with ionic substances being dissolved by polar substances. So those would be additions, thoughts, discussions that you can have with classmates, or as you're reading, or questions you can ask in class. This is of course beyond the scope of what would be expected of a student. This set of notes here that shows those 6 R's that is in Cornell notes is a 4 out of 4. Could it be better? Sure, I just gave you examples how you can improve it. Go back and check your material. Perhaps erase instead of just scratch out, add on to the material as you move forward, rewrite the notes. Sure, I don't mind if you like typing your answers. Some people they learn from just typing it out. They think it's fun. I have several friends of mine that I went to school with that actually did go through the trouble of typing the answers, writing them in shorthand, or the notes, writing them in shorthand, and then typing out the answers. Sure, you can do that. Nothing wrong with that. I just think there's a lot of time spent on that, and I don't think it's wasted. I think it's time that it will help you learn, right? Every time you rewrite these notes, every time you do something like this, you can call that time into studying, time into understanding. Every time you write a question in the margin that you're going to get an answer to, that helps you understand your notes better, is one step closer to getting that A on that test. Now, in this first test, your lowest grade was dropped. So your lowest assessment grade was dropped in this first quarter. That won't happen in the second quarter and beyond. Okay, I felt that you needed that support to help you, to help encourage you to continue to try. And I think a lot of you did really well on this test, by the way. But there were some kids that struggled. And as I said, where people that struggled mainly first by not doing the assignments, not taking notes, not going through the trouble of these 6 R's, and then on top of that, coming in and taking the test and trying to apply the things that you should have learned here in the notes or in the assignments or in class asking questions. you came to the test and you were left without understanding. And that is going to be an issue that's going to keep repeating itself if you don't correct the basic mistake of not taking good notes, not doing the work on time, not asking the questions in class or in asynchronous time, not getting tutoring, not identifying where it is that you need help. These are problems. This is high school. You have to work through the material. You have to identify what you need to improve and then find the answers, find the way to practice the material correctly so that when you get to the test, there's very few surprises and you're able to do the very best that you can. All right, I hope this helped.